Hello, I'm Tom Hartman in Washington, D.C., and here's what's coming up tonight on a special edition of The Big Picture. Even before we started doing a regular Your Take, My Take segment, I received a lot of feedback from many of you on a number of different big picture stories and ideas that we've covered over the show over the last few months. So tonight we'll revisit some of these segments in a special best of edition of The Big Picture. Enjoy. You need to know this. There's a secret that Paul Ryan and the Republicans, who are arguing for even more tax cuts for millionaires and billionaires, frankly, don't want you to know about. It's a secret that every Republican president since Ronald Reagan, and even to a certain extent Bill Clinton, didn't want us to know about. And that secret is that supply-side economics, what we sometimes call trickle-down economics or Reaganomics, doesn't work. In fact, it only works to do one thing: create a massive wealth inequality that screws over 98% of us and rains down money on the other 2% who use that extra cash to speculate on Wall Street and crash our economy. Supply-side economics has never, ever worked anywhere it's ever been tried, anywhere in the world. It's never worked. Trickle-down economics only produces a nation of peons. Yet here, Republicans are trying to pass a budget that will embrace an even more radical version of Reaganomics, further slashing the tax rates for America's oligarchs and leaving the rest of us to pick up the tab by dropping our health insurance, taking food off our tables, and letting us retire in poverty. But for the first time in more than 30 years, we now have an American president who's actually refusing to embrace Reaganomics. Perhaps the most significant part of President Obama's speech last night was when he said this.
And worst of all, this is a vision that says even though Americans can't afford to invest in education at current levels or clean energy, even though we can't afford to maintain our commitment on Medicare and Medicaid, we can somehow afford more than $1 trillion in new tax breaks for the wealthy. Think about that. In the last decade, the average income of the bottom 90% of all working Americans actually declined. Meanwhile, the top 1% saw their income rise by an average of more than $250,000 each. That's who needs to pay less taxes? They want to give people like me a $200,000 tax cut that's paid for by asking 33 seniors each to pay $6,000 more in health costs. That's not right. And it's not going to happen as long as I'm president.
As the president said, the bottom 90% of us in the last 30 years have seen our incomes rise by a measly 1%. That's it, just 1%. Economist David K. Johnston recently did some really great research and writing on supply-side economics and taxes and came up with some of these startling results I want to share with you. Take a look at this chart. It shows income growth for the bottom 90% of Americans between 1950 and 1980, before Reaganomics, and after Reaganomics, 1980 to 2008. This is going to blow your mind. And it's exactly what Paul Ryan and the Republicans, as well as those millionaires and billionaires like Dick Armey and the Koch brothers that fund the Tea Party, are trying so desperately to hide. Between 1950 and 1980, the bottom 90% saw their incomes grow over 75%, $13,000, 75% pay raise. But between 1980 and 2008, after Ronald Reagan, the bottom 90% saw their incomes grow about $300. As President Obama said, a 1% pay increase. This is the bottom 90% of us. Before Reagan, we made 75% over 30 years increase. After Reagan, almost 30 years, 1%. Now, I know what you're thinking. America's wealth has grown dramatically since 1980, so if that growth isn't being reflected in the wages of the bottom 90%, where is it? Where'd all the money go? Well, it went to the richest of the richest Americans. It went to Reagan's campaign contributors, America's oligarchs. Let's take a look at how the top 1/100th of 1%, 0.001%, did thanks to Reaganomics. From 1950 to 1980, this top 1/100th of 1% had average income, or an increased income of $2.4 million, about an 80% pay raise. That was about the same as the bottom 90%, 75%. But after Reagan, from 1980 to basically today, their incomes went up by nearly $22 million. That's a 403% pay raise for people who are already the wealthiest Americans. So thanks to Reagan, the bottom 90% of us got a 1% pay raise, while the top 1/100th of 1% of already rich people got a 403% pay raise. This has already happened. This is what the Republicans don't want you to know. But there's more. You know how Republicans are always saying that the wealthy pay the most taxes and that almost 50% of the country doesn't pay any taxes at all because they don't make enough money? It's a lie. While a large group of poor people indeed don't pay any federal income taxes, they still pay tons of other taxes. In fact, if you include payroll taxes, gas taxes, sales taxes, property taxes, they pay more taxes than the rich as a percentage of their income. Take a look at this chart, showing the taxes on the average working single American compared to the 400 richest people in America. With an average income of $26,000, the average worker pays just over $6,000 in taxes. That's 23%. This is the average person. The average $26,000. Now, at this level, they're probably not paying any federal income tax, but they are paying $6,000 in taxes, 23% of their income. On the other hand, the top 400 richest people in America are oligarchs, the campaign contributors to the Republicans. They make an average of around $350 million a year. They pay a combined tax rate of a little less than 17%. So the poorest working Americans get a tax rate of 23%, while the richest Americans, who often don't even work at all, you know, the Waltners and whatnot, just sitting on their butts around the swimming pool collecting dividend checks, they pay less than 17%. Working Americans pay more than a third more in taxes than the oligarchs who Paul Ryan and the Republicans want to give another tax break to. And as far as corporate taxes go, you know, those corporate tax rates the Republicans say are way too high, preventing business from staying in America. Consider this. Even though GE made $14 billion in profits last year, they paid zero taxes, no taxes at all. And in fact, got a tax rebate of over $3 billion, paid for by you and me. Let's look at the corporate tax picture just since George W. Bush came into office and put Reaganomics on steroids. In 2000, corporations made more than $1.6 trillion in profits and paid on average 15% in taxes. That's well below the 35% rate that Republicans often tout as being too high. Nobody actually pays that rate in the United States. In fact, tax collections in the United States of the 34 OECD countries were second to the bottom. And in 2008, these corporations made even more money and paid, you guessed it, less than taxes. They made more than $1.8 trillion and paid around 12.5%. That's what an army of lobbyists paid to buy off lawmakers and blow holes in the corporate tax code can do for you. And as Pulitzer Prize-winning writer and economist David K. Johnston points out, it's the secret that Republicans don't want you to know. Now, this is pretty simple stuff. We now know that supply-side economics doesn't work. That in fact, the phrase supply side was invented by a guy named Jude Wanniski, who is not an economist. He was a Republican strategist. The whole thing was a hoax. George Herbert Walker Bush called it voodoo economics, at least in the primaries when he was running against Ronald Reagan. He at least had the good sense after he was elected president, after 8 years of wreckage, Reagan taking us from less than $1 trillion in deficit to over $3 trillion in deficit, saying, oh, well, we got to make the economy look good. Yeah, give me $3 trillion. I'll show you what it looks like to live large. Anyhow, George Herbert Walker Bush at least had the decent sense to raise taxes a little bit. But really now is the time to run the stake through the heart of this vampire of supply-side economics, Reaganomics, trickle-down economics, whatever you want to call it. It doesn't work unless you're the top 1%.